down in tornado weather, or we didn't know if we were going to make it or not. It was like we're here, so it's terrific. This is our second conversation with the surrounding community. Normally, none of us get to see these projects at this stage. Right? You don't get to see them volume a little bit. You don't normally get to see projects that are in process until they get to a point where your planning commission or your council is voting on. And we like to do this because we find out so much from early stage exploration in designing these kinds of villages and integrated little places, and it helps us. So the only way we can do that at UDA and our team is to lead it by drawing. So this is a conversation over drawings that we start, and we continuously refine drawings until we get to a point where we think we understand what the character of each neighborhood wants to be, what the character of the streets wants to be, and among all the technical issues that we have to resolve along the way. So the more input we get, the better I think the plan can be. And by the time it gets to the official process that Tom is talking about, which sometimes takes months and months, you've already seen some of it. You know what's happening, you know what's going to be presented, and you've got a good visual picture of it. So we use this as part of our method in early design. So it's fun to be able to talk about this at this point. There are a lot of steps in our process. We're like at step 3 right now. You know, we first try to understand exactly what's happening in the site and what's contributing to the site from adjacent properties, or from traffic patterns, or from land use patterns. So that site, we've been several months in evaluating the site from different perspectives. And then we were doing market analysis. What could happen here? What's feasible? What mix do you need of different uses to make a little village like this work? There ain't a whole lot of people building villages anymore. And it's hard stuff to do, and you have to get it right. Though we all want these kind of environments, they're really difficult to put together. And you've got to be very mindful about it and very specific about what you want to achieve. So that we start to understand both the capacity of the market, what could fit in here, we think. And when you see numbers, these are really preliminary numbers. People asked last time, you didn't tell us how many units or what, how much square footage. So we've got some up here, but there you'll see, you know, there are pluses and minuses about where we think the range that we're going to be in, so we can have conversations about that, and we can start testing things like traffic and the impact and Old Big Cove growth and how that works. So this part of the process is testing concepts. So we've been through a bit of this with Tom and the city and looking at different configurations of the site, and then we've been interviewing engineers and stormwater specialists and folks in traffic transportation consultants to talk to us about, you know, how it needs to work and what this needs to be like to be successful. So when we finish this, you know, in another couple of months on concept development, then it'll start going through zoning and regulatory process. We don't have all the answers right now. We haven't done every last study. So we're right at the beginning and kind of in the middle of that. So this is a good time for us to be talking about what's possible. So we'll go through that step 4. Then we get into detailed site design after zoning and site regulation. That's another good bit of time. And then we have to go through site design approvals, right? So this is always sort of a rolling process. And then vertical building design and approvals. So there's a lot, as Tom said, but if we do it methodically, the way that our master plans work is we kind of have an instruction manual that goes along with it to say, this is what was approved, this is what we saw for character, this is how we want architecture to look here, this is how we want the parks to function. So it's pretty well prescribed by the time you get into the building phase. One of the great benefits of this is just a little a board of some of the comments that came out of the last meeting. You can read those comments on the city's website. It's posted there, a much more extensive array of feedback that we got. And we're going to ask you to do the same thing tonight. We've got Post-its. It's real simple. We've got Post-its outside. You can write down comments, stick them on a board, and then we put all those in the computer and play them back to you so you can see what your neighbors were saying, and when there's consensus about some things, you know, for us, it starts identifying an important direction. So make sure you go on the website and look at that. We'll do the same thing for this meeting. We'll report out for that. We have developed a series, I won't go through each of these, but a series of design principles. And for us, that means, what are we trying to achieve here? What are we hearing that's important? What does the city want to make sure it happens in this region with new development? And you heard a lot about trail connectivity. You heard a lot about walkability. We want this to be walkable at every stage so that you don't have to get in your car, you know, for every little move here. So those sorts of things we think are very important to us. This whole notion of being environmentally responsible and sustainable here. So all the systems we look at to deal with stormwater and regrowing forest and habitats that are important to the ecological health of this region, those are all kind of pieces that we study and begin to infuse in the core of the design. So you know, there are about 8 or 9 principles here. We want to make sure that when we look at the design, we can evaluate it from that perspective. We're really taken with the history of the site, the Drake family, and reading. Tom, it was interesting for me to go back and just kind of read about the history of the settlement in Big Cove, and the Drakes have been here since anybody's been here. So to have a farm, a working farm, that is becoming something else in this day and age, is we take that with us as a serious responsibility to not just transform it into something unrecognizable, but actually to build on that heritage and build something that's of this place and is really kind of unique. You know, it has some of that DNA that's still in it. So as we go through this, you'll see ideas for different neighborhoods and character for those. And when you look at the site plan, you'll see where we're sort of celebrating that part of the agricultural heritage in the new plan. So we've created this little model of a village where the village center, with any of its shops and restaurants or professional offices, that sort of thing, would be up near Sutton Road in Old Big Cove. Old Big Cove goes right through the middle of it. And Old Big Cove is a busy road. And we've heard a lot about that as well, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. We call them garden neighborhoods, which are clustered around the south of that. We'll talk about those a little bit more. Mostly single-family detached houses, and Meadowlark Park, which is the beautiful pond that's in that farm, has its own kind of character as a public park, but also as an address for a neighborhood of a different type. When we started this, we looked back at the big picture, which was Huntsville's comprehensive plan for the whole city. And particularly in this region and almost at this site, it identified the public response during the formation of the big picture is to have a walkable place that became a center where events could happen, where people could have social engagement in there, and they can walk, and there's something interconnected about it all. And Providence, which is out on the west side, was identified as a model. And we know Providence really well. And it is a great model, and it is working well. When you talk to people who live there, they're very excited about it and very happy with it. So that's the kind of format where you've got a very diverse range of housing, lots of different shops and restaurants, and good public space and parks that are part of that neighborhood. So we're interested in that whole idea of creating a new center. And then thinking about the character, you know, when it's a commercial center and it's got shops on the ground floor, might have apartments or small offices above. What are those buildings in the core? And then as we get to the south, the east and the west feathers out into being more neighborhood, more neighborhood scale, but all the neighborhoods are a bit different in character from one another, different sizes and types of housing, and different addresses along the way. Creating these links we talked about, you guys have an amazing series of greenways and nature preserves all around us, but they're all separated. And the goal here is for this site to become a hub, as Tom mentioned. Could it become a base camp or a hub for the, to go on? Oh, so I was just talking to the dark. Not long for there. So when we talk about creating these links and we look at like the big Cove Creek Greenway or the Blevins Gap Nature Preserve, we know we're in striking distance to be able to connect these tubes up and put a little light plug through the center of the village, but we don't own that land either. So part of what we've been doing is talking to the trail groups, talking to the land trust, talking to adjacent property to understand where we can start to get trails to connect up. So we want to be ready for that. And inside the village itself, this is primarily a pedestrian-oriented village, so there are lots of trails that are internal that we could link up to. And you can kind of see it in this diagram. Everything in red is a trail, and they're not just tiny trails. These are 12-foot wide multi-use paths. So I can get on there on my e-bike. I can push a baby stroller there with my kids. If I have accessibility issues, these are accessible. So these are for everybody. They're not just for the mountain hikers or for the serious bike riders. These are very much communal system. There are 2.7 miles of trails shown in this little village. So you could do a loop in the middle, you could do a loop on the outside, you could connect to things that are off-site. So we think it's a really great structure for a village, and it's fun to build on that as a framework. Environmental integration, we talked about a bit with the pond that's there. It's stunningly beautiful just as a natural piece, so we see that as a kind of wildflower meadow that will come back around the pond. There will be a little bit of additional water bodies to handle stormwater and rain water as part of that system. But it is that tied to the drainage way, which you see going as a snake across the site. That becomes kind of the core system that we're building around and fronting, and you'll see a little bit of that. Because we think every piece of infrastructure that goes here ought to be celebrating these kind of natural resources. So it's a fun place to be in. So when you cross that sort of spine, it's a great experience. It's a memorable experience, not just crossing a ditch like it is now. So we hope to transform that. And then we talked a little bit about the center, Old Cove Road, for the very northern part of it as it connects to Sutton. There's like a block there that has shops facing that street. And then there's also a little plaza off to the side that has a good amount of the remaining retail there as well. So we see that being highly animated, broad sidewalks, people can sit out there, windows and shops can open up and bring life to the streets. And you end up with like a little flower in a way, like this diagram, where when you see the red buildings up in the north, those are buildings that have shops on the ground floor. And anything else that's in an orange or yellow would be all housing. So, you know, the core of it is pretty compact, pretty walkable. And actually every neighborhood is within a 5-minute walk to the center. So that's kind of nice if you can keep it small like that. You look on the right-hand side, you see the pond. You also see some of the neighborhoods on either side of the pond, but that whole core of the pond is a park space. that stays public. And then there are a series of small neighborhood parks that are sprinkled throughout the village like a little constellation. We wanted to talk a little bit about this idea, when you look at the drawing there of Old Big Cove Road coming in. One of the things we found after our first meeting, and then as we've been exploring it with the city, is that, and you guys know this because you all live out here, there's a ton of traffic, and there's more to come, and it's not a surprise. It's all, it's all over this region and the growth. So we will, as we go through this design, we're looking at it with the city's transportation engineers, talking about making sure that we increase the amount of traffic that can come through there at any light, particularly in the mornings and in the evenings when there's a lot of traffic in the peak hours. And then add parking to that on the edges for those first 2 blocks so that you can get out and go into a shop. You don't have to go into a parking garage or pull into a lot. And so we'll work through that to make sure that we don't create a traffic nightmare at that intersection. So that whole area will be rebuilt. We're looking at 4-laning Old Big Cove Road all the way through the village. And that may extend south of us because you've already got a huge pressure on that road anyway for movement. So we wanted to make that clear. There was a lot of questions about that last time. This may have a boulevard in the middle, a tree lawn for the second block as it goes into residential, so it doesn't feel so wide. And we've actually have a small one now. We can look at it in a minute. In the middle, as it comes up to Sutton Road, so that when you're crossing it, we want to make it pedestrian friendly. How we do that? So it may be a different kind of paving material that's across there. There may be a light there. We don't know yet, but we know we got to slow traffic down. We don't want to stop it, but now you're in somebody's neighborhood or you're in somebody's village, and it's not just 55 miles an hour. Try to make the light when it's turning yellow. So we're thinking a lot about those street sections, and particularly Old Big Cove Road, and how we can assure neighborhoods who are already here that they're not going to be trapped in a traffic nightmare every morning and every afternoon. So when you look at the boards outside, we actually go through every street in this concept plan and draw it and then test it. Now we can test it with the transportation engineers and make sure we've got the right lane widths, we've got the right turning movements, and we've got the right character for the type of street it is versus a small residential street being something that's very different than the big through streets. So those are, that's been a lot of the study, and as we get into zoning and approvals, that'll become a big point of review for the city. This idea of the parks and open space, we've got the trails, and then we're using that drainage swale as a giant park, and the houses will face that on either side without a street in front of them. They'll have a 12-foot multi-use path instead of a street. So they'll be actually living on the edge of the park there. And the streets are behind for those neighborhoods, and we'll look at those a bit. But it's what we find that people are really asking for in these kind of environments are not giant parks, but are neighborhood parks that have different program functions. And I can go to a different park every day, and sort of thing. So you look at the little diagram there, and every time you see a green spot, it's either a community garden, a kid's playground, or some recreation courts. There's some pickleball courts on one end. So the idea of trying to really mix it up and make it a delightful place to live in and to visit was the idea. The notion of what kind of houses would go in here, what kind of other buildings besides mixed use. We've looked at attached houses that may, in this context, we don't see this as like a downtown kind of big row house sort of thing, but 2 units, 3 units, 4 units that look like big houses are more, we think, more the character for these garden neighborhoods. And so you see those on the left-hand side. There are what we call cottage lots, smaller houses that folks like me who are empty nesters like to move into after our kids are gone, or young families. So it's the same sort of thing. It's a detached house, but it's a little bit smaller they're a little bit smaller lots, and then they step up to village lots, which get to be a bit bigger. Most all of these houses have access in the back, right? So you're not going to walk down the street. There's nothing but continuous driveways and the rear ends of cars sticking out on the street. So it makes for, we think, a really pleasant experience and a very functional kind of lot. As we get to the south, and we'll look at these in the neighborhood we call Prospect, there will be some houses that will have front driveways, and they're bigger. Those lots are a little bit bigger to accommodate the driveway and accommodate a larger house. Those typically are on the perimeter. And then there are some, 4 to be in this plan to be exact, that are starting to climb up into the woodlands that are just beside the TVA power line, this big power line that runs by us. And we want to preserve those. So those will only be houses that get placed in those lots, those 4. And the idea there is to conserve all of as much of that tree cover as we can, and only begin to clear the part that's necessary. So that's a very specific kind of surgical house type. Not many, but important, we think, to preserve that. So there are a bunch of different neighborhoods of different character. What we're calling the village center, Drake Commons, and we'll look at that a little bit more. Around the pond is Meadowlark Park. Garden Crescent is following the stream and wetland system that we're proposing. Prospect is a little bit south, and it's up on the hill a bit, so it has great views over the village and to the distance. And then there's a little neighborhood on the western side called West Court. And so if we go through each one of those, here's what's sort of emerging. In Drake Commons, if you look at the image in the upper left-hand corner, that's Old Big Cove Road reimagined. That's with its parking, with its wider lanes, but you can see the broad sidewalks, very much like Providence. Providence did it right. They have great, deep 24, 26-foot brick sidewalks there. We are proposing that we do the same thing. And then those buildings change as you go down the street. You see the image below that, and that's on one side of the Commons. The Commons has a big green in the middle. You see it with the pink around it. And that's to, be a park, a daily park. But if you're going to have a festival, if you're going to have an event, that's the place that we think is appropriate for that. And it's right in the middle of everything. Shops on either side of it, right adjacent to Old Big Cove Road. So we think in total, there's not a whole lot of commercial, because we're not going to get big box stuff or big grocery stores here. So there's about 58,000 square feet, and another bit in what we think is like a food hall or a brewery, distillery kind of uses that congregate in a larger building. And that brings that up to about 73,000 square feet, plus or minus. Office space, we call it office space. It's really like for design shops or real estate offices or insurance sales, that sort of thing. We imagine that to be second floor above the shops in some of these buildings, rather than standalone big office buildings that you build. That's not a market that we're interested in here. And then the village center apartments. Most of these are apartments above the shops. There's about 694 in the core of it, all in about 24 different buildings. So they're sprinkled about within the center in many different sizes, different kinds. There's no rubber stamping any kind of one size fits all here. And then we got to park it all, because this is where people are coming in the evening. And you'll see in the Commons, there are 2 structured parking garages to get into that are wrapped around with the building, and then there's some surface parking and on-street parking on every street. Right beside that, around the pond, where we talked about Meadowlark Park, the park is about 5.5 acres. Community gardens, we think, are a big part of that, and we wanted to focus on that as a central amenity for particularly this community. Coming right out of the Drake legacy, this is not a working farm anymore, but it's got great soil, it's beautiful, and we think around the pond and around the park is a great place to celebrate the agricultural legacy. The buildings over there will be different. They'll be like farmstead buildings. And there's some photographs of those. We've done a little project like this up in Rochester, New York. It was an old farm. And it's really fun to think about those more agrarian buildings as something that's completely counter to a village center kind of commercial building. So there are about 110 units over here of one type or another. Mostly they're in apartment buildings, but there are also some small cottages that are on this side as well. And you can see that drawing in the upper left-hand corner here. So 110 units, about 190 spaces for parking. And we think this is going to make a really sweet kind of address within the village. The Garden Crescent neighborhoods, they all have this continuous frontage. You come out your front door, you can get on the trail, and you can walk all through the village. Right? There's no cars out in front, all the cars are being serviced behind. And there are about 127 units total. Some are attached, others are detached in the Garden Crescent neighborhoods. And when you look at that little image there, people standing on a bridge, the streets that cross there will form that. So you'll get overlooks on each one of those kind of crossings in the middle of the village. And then one of those is completely pedestrian to get you from the south into the heart of the village. The last neighborhood, or next to last neighborhood here is Prospect. It's the one that's just to the south. Old Big Cove Road forms one edge, and then you can see the green, 4 of the green lots that go up the hill are those woodland conservation lots. But, this is a neighborhood that's got almost every housing type that we have here in it, except for multifamily. So it's attached single-family, detached single-family of different sizes, and the woodland preserve lots. The West Court are smaller apartment buildings that surround the larger building that's connected to the parking garage. So there are about 90 units in those, and they form a little court. There are 2 parks back there, and in the northwest, and then the south. If you look at, maybe you see the cursor. If you look at the southern end of that, with the sort of 4 little blue courts, that's meant to be a little neighborhood park. It's got pickleball in it in this diagram, so that we get parks of different character and nature close to everybody. So there's a little dog park in the north called for in this one as well. So it's got all kinds of fun things with it, and it's right up against the big road, right, as you come. So we tried to build in a buffer setback all along there, and the trail, as you can see, connects this neighborhood back into the village from the north to the south. We talked about the different kind of building types. The one on the left is a building from the project I talked about called Erie Station, and they're all different kinds of these. So we imagine that some of that is much more, it looks like it was meant to be on a farm, is around the Meadow Lark Park. And that's the only time it shows up. So all the other neighborhoods are a mix of kind of different architectural styles that come out of Huntsville and this region. And then in the village center, it'll be a range of buildings. Some 3, 4-story, and maybe 5-story buildings where you get the ground floor with shops and then the upper levels with apartments. And so this is sort of Providence style on the right-hand side, and farmstead style on the left. There's a summary of everything that we just talked about in terms of parking, in terms of the professional offices or the commercial shop fronts, the multifamily apartments, and the single family, attached and detached. So you can take a look at what we're starting with to test. So as we start to test trip generation here in the roads and how Old Big Cove Road is performing, we'll use this basic program to test and see where we are, what's working, what's not working, and refine it from there. So this is our best guess at this point. But we did want to make sure that we were testing those kinds of numbers. We hadn't gotten to this point yet in July, so we didn't talk about it as much. But now we're getting a little bit clearer picture of what fits, how it works within the block plan and the design of the village that we just looked at.